This land is your land, and this land is my land, from the California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
Grain. It's barley and wheat, millet and corn, oats and rice. Truly the staple crop, grains are grown in greater quantities than any other type of crop in the world. In their natural form, they are a rich source of vitamins, minerals, carbohydrates, fats, oils, and protein. More food energy is obtained from grains than any other type of crop in the world. Yet man, with an ever-increasing appetite for ingenuity, has found another use for grains. Biofuel. There are two basic types of agrofuels, those that are ethanol-based and are derived from fermenting the sugar components of plants such as corn, wheat, sugar cane, and sugar beets, and biodiesels that are derived from animal fat or plant oils such as algae or soybeans. Biofuels, which are usually mixed with petroleum-based fuels in order to reduce the amount required for transportation, provided 1.8% of the world's transport fuel in 2008. Investment into biofuels production capacity exceeded $4 billion worldwide in 2007 and is continuing to grow. In the U.S., this increase in investment in production of biofuels is primarily driven by policies aimed at reducing dependence on oil from foreign providers. In 2009, 1/3 of the grain grown in the U.S. went to producing ethanol to be mixed with gasoline. Corn makes up more than 90% of the grain used to produce ethanol in the U.S. Coincidentally or not, this increase in the use of food crops to supplement the world's transportation needs has occurred simultaneously with drastic increases in global food prices. Since 2005, food prices have increased by 83%, a trend that has prompted warnings of a food crisis throughout much of the world and has resulted in food riots in over 30 countries in the past 5 years. From last October to January alone, price indices rose 15%, which according to a World Bank report could have put around 44 million people around the world into poverty. Are U.S. ethanol and biodiesel production policies really impacting global food prices? The answer is complex, unclear, and controversial. I posed the question to Senator Charles Grassley, a GOP representative for the breadbasket state of Iowa, and to Dr. Paul Collier, professor of economics, director of the Center for Study of African Economies, Oxford University, and author of the book, The Politics of Hunger. First to Senator Grassley. How are global food prices, namely those of grain cereals, tied to U.S. biofuel production?
There is very little relationship. Some economists have shown that the 20% increase in the corn price in 2008 was responsible for just pennies of the increase in food prices, not the doubling or tripling of food prices, as vouched by our grocery lobby advocate friends. But I've heard what they're saying about the price of bread in Egypt and rice in China and that food in Mexico, those tortillas. But let me point out the obvious. We don't make ethanol out of rice or wheat. So I'm not sure that I understand, except ignorance, on the part of the people about the connection between making ethanol and making our food. Because I could set a bucket full of corn in front of those people from the IMF. Or we could go where they're complaining, and they wouldn't know what to do with it. Any more than I would know what to do if an Eskimo set a pail full of blubber in front of me. So I'm not very sympathetic to it at this point. When they start getting a connection between corn and food, then I'll be glad to listen. Part of our problem is that the Chinese are going to eat meat. And when you've got corn and soybeans to feed the Chinese their meat, then why isn't it just as legitimate for the Chinese to go back and eat rice as it is for us to change our policy on corn and ethanol?
Of course, there are others who hold the opposing view that the global food market has been impacted significantly by U.S. biofuel production policies. One such individual is Dr. Collier.
Oh, without a doubt. The huge loss of grain for food caused by its diversion into ethanol has had an impact on world grain prices. But just how large of an impact is controversial. An initial claim by the Bush administration was that it would raise prices by only 3%, but a study by the World Bank suggested that the effect had been more like 10 to 25%. if the subsidy were lifted, there would probably be a swift impact on prices. Not only would the supply of grain for food increase, but the change would shift speculative expectations. The question is also more complex than asking whether or not an increase in the use of corn to produce ethanol will increase the global price of corn. Shortages and inflation in prices of different kinds of products are occurring because of this shift in use of resources. Farmers who formerly grew crops like vegetables for consumption are now planting different crops that can be used for fuel because they make more money doing so. Take cassava, for example, which is grown in high volumes in Southeast Asia and is now being heavily imported into China for production of biofuel. Because cassava chips have been commonly used as animal feed, the new demand from biofuels industry could affect the availability and cost of meat. In Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, where China is generously paying for stockpiles of cassava, farmers may be tempted to grow the crop instead of, for example, other vegetables or rice.
So where does all of this leave us? Should we simply stop using grains to produce ethanol? Are there other options that we should be pursuing? Grassley believes that ethanol production from corn is critical to the U.S. economy.
Unlike with food prices, there certainly is a relationship between ethanol and our energy. National, economic, and environmental security. Between 2004 and 2008, the U.S. lost over $1.9 trillion to OPEC, forming half of our trade deficit over that period. We're sending this money to Canada, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Venezuela, Nigeria, and other countries, instead of supporting ethanol. It's a crime that the government's support of ethanol is only 2% of money we send to OPEC, $350 billion in 2008. Let's support ethanol and assert our energy independence, so that we move away from relying on foreign fuels for 60% of our energy needs. We can't let these Chavezes, these Ahmadinejad question our national security. We also can't let up the subsidy, because ethanol production is responsible for 400,000 green jobs, $50 billion of our GDP, and $8.4 billion of tax revenue. Compare that to the nearly $7 billion subsidy to the industry. Even I can do that math and see that this means over $1 billion in surplus tax revenue. Staying on the topic of green, ethanol doesn't lead to environmental degradation, unlike oil with its consequences, like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and the degradation resulting from Canadian shale oil fields. Also, ethanol contributes 50% less fuel emissions than gasoline. So basically, ethanol has no negatives. Everything about it is good, good, good.
Collier seems to think otherwise.
There is good case for growing fuel, but there's not a good case for generating it from American grain. The conversion of grain into ethanol uses almost as much energy as it produces. It takes 10 units of energy to generate 11 units. But of course, the guys who produce the 11 at the cost of the 10 run away with a subsidy on all 11 and not on the 1. There are other options such as using cellulosic feedstocks, woods, grasses, and non-edible parts of plants to produce ethanol. Currently, the chemical processes used to convert these materials is inefficient. We need to improve these processes if ethanol is going to be used as a global fuel option in the long run. But we also have Brazilian sugarcane, which is the most efficient feedstock for biofuel. The killer evidence of political capture is the response of the US government to this potential lifeline. It has actually restricted imports of Brazilian sugarcane-based ethanol to protect American production. The goal of reducing dependence on Arab oil has been sacrificed to the self-serving goal of pumping yet more tax dollars into American agriculture. And why are you doing this? You're doing it because your brilliant agricultural lobby, which is one of the most effective subsidy hunters on earth, has scared you. And how has it scared you? It has fed you lies about being dependent on foreign oil. The lie being that biofuels will reduce that. Because you have been fed lies, African children won't be fed enough to face malnutrition.
Though the situation is complex and the right answer is difficult to discern, one thing is clear. the importance of global food and energy dependence is only going to increase. Whether by reducing the amount of grain cereals that are used to produce biofuel, using genetically modified crops to increase our agricultural production, or regulating the amount of grains that are used to feed livestock in order to meet global increased demand for meat in developed countries, something must be done in order to ensure that the world's poor are adequately fed.
This land is your land, and this land is my land, from the California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. As I went a-walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway, saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me.